Welcome back to another IAPSS presentation from the lecture series. Today it is Lisa's turn to present on the matter of nationhood, a matter of identity or place. Apologies, Lisa.
Hey, thank you. So my name is Lisa Carroll. I'm part of the Political Theory Student Research Committee. My background is in politics and international relations and philosophy, but at the moment I'm trying to complete my Master's of Science in Sustainability, Society and Environment in Germany. Nationhood is something that I kind of recently got into thinking about. I was never too interested in the topic, but because I studied climate change and the effects of climate change, nationhood kind of became, I guess, what I realized was a sort of forgotten aspect of climate change. So as you'd seen in the ad, really what I'm going to be talking about is the impact that deterritorialization can have on nationality, and whether the idea of nationality is a shared identity or is it really connected to territory or land, which is going to be the major impact of deterritorialization, especially in the oceanic small island countries. So I'll begin with a problem statement. So in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there is a human right to nationality. However, this human right, it's, as you'll see, it is problematic. And my main statement here is that in contrary to international law, there's no internationally legal sorry, my dog. There's no internationally recognized legal right to a nationality without physical territory. And when we start to look at law, we need to really look at responsibilities and corresponding duties. So we need to look at who that law places responsibility on, and also what the actual responsibilities are. So who has a responsibility for human rights law? So it's primarily states. And I mentioned states as legal entities, as they are legal entities under international law. This is probably not something that we're used to thinking about, is that the state is an entity in itself that is legally responsible. Usually we think of governments or persons who are responsible, but the state itself under international law is considered a legal person. So now we need to look at what responsibilities. So the right here is laid out in Article 15.1, but we have to look at the corresponding duties, which is laid out in 15.2. So the responsibilities here are that a state cannot deprive someone born on their territory of nationality, a state cannot revoke the nationality of someone born on their territory, and a state must extend nationality to any person born on the territory the state has taken over. So what you can see here is that I'm quite consistently mentioning a territory, either the person born to the territory that the state is on, or if a state takes over another state, they have to, under international law, extend nationality to the people on the territory that they've taken over. So this is really where we have to think about, again, there's a third factor. So who has responsibilities, what responsibilities, and to who are the responsibilities owed? So in general, states have a responsibility within and outside their territory to their citizens and nationals, and within their territory to residents and visitors. I've termed them primary and secondary responsibility because they have different right claims. In terms of human rights, everybody has to be have their human rights respected, but really a state is only responsible for ensuring the human rights of citizens and nationals. Anyone outside of their territory, they aren't really responsible for unless they violate human rights in another country. So this is really where we have to start thinking about human right to nationality. So to whom does the state have responsibility to provide nationality? So really that's to any person that comes under the conditions set out under sovereign domestic law. This is part of customary international law. It's considered a foundational principle of international law. It's not codified, but it's practiced long enough that it is respected. One caveat to that, though, is that domestic law has to be consistent with international conventions, customs, and principles of law regarding nationality. This is laid out in the Convention on Certain Questions Relating to the Conflict of Nationality Laws. This is not a really well-known document. I don't even think it's very widely cited, but in terms of human rights, we do tend to think that any laws regarding nationality, any domestic laws, have to be in line with the human right to a nationality, so a state can't arbitrarily deprive someone of a nationality. We go back to kind of the first slide there, where we're talking about states as legal entities. And the reason we talk about that is because, as I mentioned, states are legal persons. They are subjects under international law, but more importantly, they're actually defined under international law. So I've highlighted here physical territory because states defined under international law and the accepted legal doctrine is the Montevideo Convention on the Rights and Duties of States. This is from 1933. And as you can see here, there's 4 constitutive elements, and a defined territory is one of those primary elements. So how does this all relate to nationality? So there is a human right to nationality, but states are the primary legal entities granting nationality. Again, this is customary international law. And also this actually can't technically be violated due to the sovereign rights of states. And states are only legal entities if they have territory. So your legal right to a nationality is connected to a state, but a state is only legal if they have territory. So that's why I say, in contrary to international law, there's no recognized legal right to a nationality without physical territory. So the starting questions here that I have, you can read them, is do we really think of nationality as a matter of territory? We tend to think of it as a bit more innate and inalienable. It's something we feel, it's something we're connected to. It's not strictly territory, but in the realm of law, it is. Another thing, can I be a nationality that I've not been legally granted? That could be problematic. Can I be a nationality granted from a state not recognized under international law? This is a huge problem at the moment. We have a huge amount of stateless nations and even people who are acting autonomously in a region, so could be considered having territory, but they're not recognized under international law. So those people are not recognized as having their legal right to that nationality. Can I be a nationality of a nation that under national law never existed? This is particularly important in terms of Oceania when we think of kind of First Nations and Indigenous groups. A lot of people do think of themselves as a nation in that way, but under international law, these nations do not exist. And the biggest questions when we start to think about deterritorialization and nationality is more personally reflective questions, thinking about, could I still be my nationality if my state ceased to exist? If the territory wasn't there anymore, could I still feel my nationality? Would you still feel connected to nationality if the state ceased to exist? I'm Irish living in Germany and I still feel connected to my home country in Ireland. I still feel Irish, but what if Ireland stopped existing all of a sudden? Could I still feel Irish? And then also, very importantly, in the context of deterritorialization, would my national and cultural identity be protected if my state ceased to exist? I've broken up parts of the explanation and parts of the argument into three. We'll talk about states and nations, the threats to oceanic nationhood, and is nationhood a matter of identity or place? So it's important to create definitions and have definitions of what a state is and what a nation is. We tend to, especially in Western countries, conflate the notion of a state and a nation, but they are distinct. So as we mentioned, a state is a territory that meets the four constitutive elements under the Montevideo Convention and or is recognized by other states. This is more to do with theories of recognition, which aren't strictly important for this presentation. A nation is considered a group of persons inhabiting a specific territory connected by history, culture, ethnicity, language, or other commonalities. A nation can also be largely considered an ethnic group, but usually when we think of a nation, we do think of people living or occupying a similar area. This doesn't actually have to be within borders. This can happen within a currently existing state, or it can be distributed across different states, as with the Kurdish. So a nation state, which is quite often what we hear kind of in the West, is a territory that meets the four constitutive elements of statehood, in which the permanent population is dominated by distinct culture, ethnicity, or other commonalities. Nation states in the West are more of a fabrication. It's not that we don't have shared ethnicities or cultures, but what has happened is when you look at borders, they've been artificially drawn and changed throughout history. So really, we're a huge amount of countries that have come together with lots of different cultures and ethnicities to create one idea of a cultural or national identity. A stateless nation is something that we don't hear of very often, and this will be particularly important for kind of the implications that climate change will have on oceanic countries. So they're a distinct and or organized group of persons residing within the territory of a legally recognized state or states. They're considered stateless because there is an implication here that this group of people should have a state. It's not the same as just an ethnic group or just a cultural group. It's the idea that this group is organized in a way that we think that they should have a state. In law, it's probably the most important distinction between states and nations. States are legally defined. So because they're legally defined, you have legal protection under international law and you have legal obligations under international law. Nations are not legally defined. When I say you have limited legal protection under international law, what that means is that you have an individual right to your human rights. Human rights are considered individual rights. So even if you are stateless, you still have your human rights. But the main issue is that there are no obligations under international law to nations. So that means if you are part of a nation, but not part of a state, although you have human rights and they shouldn't be violated, there's no state responsible for actually ensuring that your rights aren't violated. In practice, states are legal entities, and we derive our legal rights from belonging to a state. Nations are not legal entities, so we derive no legal rights from our belonging to a nation. So here we come back to the idea. So why do we have a human rights with nationality if we derive no rights from it? So we now kind of need to look at Western and non-Western. I'll come back to that question. But in the Western and non-Western concepts of nationhood, Western is what we call civic nationalism. It's a term used in the literature. We don't hear it in normal discourse that often. Where a nation is defined by its geographical borders. It correlates with citizenship. And in this way, nationality gives legal rights. If you are a national of a country, you are legally owed citizenship from that country. So in this way, our term, the Western concept of nationhood, is very much rooted in place. Non-Western, the term used in the literature is ethnic nationalism. It's not my favorite term to use because there's a lot of negative connotations that's come along with ethnic nationalism, but in the literature it's termed ethnic nationalism. This is where a nation is defined by ethnicity, or as I say, a shared characteristic. It doesn't have to be strictly ethnicity. Nationality does not correlate with citizenship, and nationality gives community rights. So what this means is that if I am part of a First Nations community, then I have rights within that community, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I have citizenship of this nation, because again, as we said, citizenship is something that belongs to states. It is legal. So in this way, the non-Western concepts of nationhood can be really closely linked with identity. So go back to that question, why do we have a human right to nationality if we derive no rights from it? And the main answer is because Western concepts have dominated international law. The majority of international law was written between Western nations, and later on, nations from primarily the global South were allowed to sign or given an ability to sign, but they weren't really involved. When you think of 1933, we still had a huge amount of colonialism. So Western concepts have dominated what we think about when we talk about international law. So, as I mentioned, the granting the membership of the state or citizenship is protected under the principle of sovereignty. What this means is that states have a right that can't be interfered with to give citizenship to who they want. They can regulate this however they want. And another issue is that Western states, as I mentioned, are largely not nations, but they have created this idea of national identity within their borders. So when I say people born within borders are granted special membership, which is considered nationality, this fosters national identity, and special membership automatically entitles you to membership of the state, which is citizenship. So the result of this really is that the concept of nation and state have been conflated. They've been used interchangeably by Western states, and then by extension, the law. But where we have the problem with this is it's a human right to nationality, not to citizenship. And you can't have a human right to citizenship because that is fully within the realms of sovereignty, which is a principle of international law that cannot be taken away. You cannot interfere with a state's sovereignty. So when we look at Oceania, Oceania is a very interesting region for me because it's very clear the distinction that's made between nationhood and the state. I studied in Australia for a year, and this is where I got introduced to the idea of nations within states. And then I began to study a bit more about the Pacific Islands, and we know that that's one of the most culturally diverse regions in the world. There's a huge amount of nations, often within quite small territories. So they make distinction between membership of a nation and membership of a state. So all members of the state have citizenship with legal rights. What that means is regardless of what nation that you were involved in, you have citizenship. You can be First Nations, but also Australian. But in addition to that, many oceanic states have distinct communities within their borders with different levels of autonomy and self-determination. We don't see this very often, particularly when Indigenous groups are in Western states, so Australia, the US, Canada. They very rarely have a culture of formally recognizing these indigenous groups, which they have in Oceania. This is an example because I've been doing a lot of work on Papua, but in the Constitution, indigenous groups are recognized as units of Papuan society. And because they're recognized as units that make up Papuan society as a part of, we have Papuan society and then we have indigenous groups. They have more autonomy and self-determination rights. So customary land title laws, what that means is that the land belongs to the indigenous group that inhabits it, and they have the right to say what happens and what doesn't happen. Obviously that is debated because we've had a lot of issues with that in Papua, but technically it is there in law, and it is also reflected across some of the smaller oceanic countries. So I guess nationhood, you can see in Oceania, is a matter of both identity and place. Customary land is a crucial element to many nation groups across Oceania. There is a distinct connection between indigenous groups and the land that they inhabit. But it's different in how we think about it in Western states. So the connection to place is not about geographic borders. So I say land often, just to not be reductive. There's so many indigenous groups, you can't possibly say with certainty about everything. So it often plays a crucial role in the identity of nation groups, whether that just be that it is a communal space, it's a shared space, or a lot of the time land and the features of the land and the history of the land play quite an important identity forming role in these nation groups. Cultural practices are influenced by the land itself, but not determined by it. So we'll see a lot of cultural practices around how people approach agriculture in Papua because there's more land, and in the Carroll Atoll Islands, you'll see how the sea is treated differently, and it actually forms a part of the identity as opposed to just being a resource. So cultural practices are influenced by that resource. And also loss of land does not negate membership of the nation. We see this very clearly, again, in the more Western countries in Oceania, so Australia and New Zealand. The nation does not cease to exist just because land was taken away. So the threats to oceanic nationhood, the most obvious, I guess, is colonization. Historically, that's a problem for all nations that are not recognized under international law, but we still have issues to this day. So modern is called residual colonialism, and then I've turned to economic and political colonialism. Economic and political colonialism are debated concepts, but it's the idea that the nation group within the state can't continue to economically or politically function outside of the specific parameters of the state. So you can't be economically independent as a nation without joining the economy of the existing state, and you can't politically organize outside of the formal parameters of the state. My main interest is on deterritorialization and state extinction and how that impacts nationhood. So how states become extinct is usually through the loss of one of the four constitutive elements, as I mentioned: territory, population, government, and capacity to enter into relations. My main interest, as I said before, is territory. So states lose the constitutive element of territory through incorporation, annexation, fusion, dismemberment, state collapse, or revolution. These aren't strictly important, but you should know that these are the accepted conditions on which people lose territory. The complete physical loss of territory is called deterritorialization. This, in recorded history, has never happened in terms of state extinction. But we know that sea level rise is really increasing the reality that states will become deterritorialized, especially the small island states. The Pacific is very very vulnerable due to a large amount of the islands being Carroll Atoll islands. Already, smaller islands belonging to oceanic states have completely disappeared. Vanuatu has lost territory. The Solomon Islands have lost some. Often these islands are uninhabited, but it doesn't matter, is the fact that we are losing territory. Islands are disappearing. This is no longer an alarmist claim. This is something that is backed up with science. Larger islands belonging to the small oceanic states are losing territory along the coast. We know this because we've seen an increase in population density and coming in towards the center of states, which traditionally would have had the majority of their population on the coastal areas. And another problem is that many areas of small oceanic states are already at or below sea level. Again, this is a major problem with Carroll Atoll Islands. Some of the volcanic islands do not have this issue. Yeah, as I said, so a lot of time people say that the idea that islands will disappear is alarmist, except the IPCC says that it is virtually certain that global mean sea level rise will continue beyond 2100. So what that means is that even if territory loss is slow, we actually know that most islands will become inhabitable before they come under sea level because of salination and also huge rise in storms. But what can eventually happen is that sea level will continue to rise. It's increasing the likelihood that small oceanic countries already at or below sea level will disappear. Now, if people have already relocated to other countries, we may think, but okay, yeah, it's very bad that these islands have disappeared, but what are the implications? If people's physical security is already accounted for, if they're already able to live in other countries, why should we worry about this? And this comes back to the idea that we have a human right to a nationality. And if states are the primary legal entities granting nationalities, and they're only legal entities if they have territory, you have no human right to a nationality if your country that you've been born to, the state you've been born to, no longer exists. You lose your nationality rights. So what happens to the nationality of persons in small oceanic countries if their country disappears? Could you still call yourself the nationality of where you're from if the territory no longer physically exists? And then what protections do nation groups have to continue their cultural practices when the state that protects them disappears? This is particularly important because a lot of people who may have to move from the small oceanic countries will more likely move to Australia and New Zealand, given that they are the larger countries in the region. And these countries already do not have a great history of protecting cultural rights of nation groups. So this is where we come back to really the identity or place thinking. So as we said, the non-Western concept of nationhood is very much based around the idea of identity. But as I mentioned, and I will keep mentioning, under international law, you do not have a legal right to nationality without physical territory. What this results in is that there's matters of international law and domestic law. So under international law, states have to respect members of other states, and they have to recognize membership of other states. So they have to respect your citizenship of another country. But there is no obligation for a state to have to recognize or respect your identity if it's based on a nation group. This is something that is inherent in domestic law. And we do have the Declaration of Indigenous Persons. But as we saw in the last seminar, this is highly contested, and non-legally binding and really can't be enforced. So I guess while nationhood can be argued to be a matter of identity, place is crucial for ensuring the protection of nationhood and any accompanying cultural rights. Nation groups in Papua are protected by the Papuan state, and the same for other oceanic countries. But nation groups in countries like Australia, Canada, America, we've seen that their cultural rights have largely been ignored, not ratified into law, or just completely disregarded. That leaves me with kind of concluding questions. So I started with the questions about, could you still be your nationality, your state ceased to exist? Could you still feel connected to a nationality if your state ceased to exist? And would your national cultural identity be protected if your state ceased to exist? So we need to think kind of on these concluding questions is, would it matter if I could still be my nationality if I couldn't practice it? Would it matter if I'm still Irish, but I had no ability to practice any of my culture that has made up my national identity? And very much where I come from is a climate justice perspective, is do nation groups deserve to lose their state nationality and the right to practice their culture because of climate change? And yeah, I guess on that note, I'll answer to any questions.
That was great. Thank you so much for it. I do have a lot of questions and quite a few points that were particularly interesting to me, but maybe someone else would like to go first. Okay, so maybe I can start and then someone else can jump in. You mentioned this idea that that national identity is something that we have created among ourselves, and it's not really natural, quote unquote. Well, like as in everything that we've ever created. But you also said that the concept of nationality and ethnicity is more of a Western concept, right?
What it is that nationality, in terms of it being connected strictly to your state, is kind of is a Western notion. So there's a difference between being a nation connected by an ethnicity. We do have nation states, they do exist, but the larger, more dominant Western states create this idea of cultural or, well, national identity, but under the actual term of nation, it doesn't fit. They're not nation states. They use the term nation states, but they're not. They're very ethnically diverse. Whereas, when you think of, say, the Kurdish, this is a very distinct ethnic group. But when you think of like mainland Europe, the borders have been changed so much, and there's been so many different types of people all subsumed within one country that they've created this idea that there is a German nationality, an Irish nationality, but really we're a mix of many different nations before the idea of state borders came into play.
The example of the Kurds is what I also had in mind, but mostly for the my next question. What I thought regarding how much of a Western idea it is actually the example of Japan.
Mm-hmm.
So there is this one main ethnic group in Japan that has been dominating over the other ethnic groups. For example, the Ainu people in Hokkaido, and then the people in the south of Japan, Okinawa. But again, when Japan was a great colonizing power in in Asia, when they, for example, colonized Korea for like 30 years, they insisted that all of the Koreans were now Japanese and they were all the emperor's children. And they forced the Korean people to adopt Japanese first names and last names. They forbid them from using the Korean language. So everything was Japanese. So you know you're a Japanese person. That's your nationality. And like that is a whole new level of colonizing someone, obviously. But it was the first thing that came into my mind when I had that linking the nationality with linking nationality and territory. And then again, as a result of this very intense assimilation process by the Japanese, the modern Korean state is really into, this is Korean and it's the best, and this is our land, Korea, and it's for Korean people. And it's another example of having nationality and territory linked.
Yeah, and another thing where that comes from, the reason that states build national identity is that really the idea of, geographic territories and borders, that we were never really supposed to live in countries that are so large. How can you possibly be connected culturally to people that aren't within your community? So they create, a national identity to unify a country. But where I get concerned, especially when it comes to oceanic countries, is that in the quest for national unity within a state, how willing are they to override a distinct nation group? We've seen it, like in Australia, they tried to completely eradicate First Nation groups. They tried to get rid of culture. They even at some point tried to lighten up skin color under the idea that they were creating an Australian state. They weren't. There's no such thing as Australian ethnicity outside of First Nations groups. These were British and Irish people who came over and created the idea of Australia. So where I get concerned, especially when it comes to deterritorialization and people who have to move, largely going to be moving into other countries who are going to say, well, okay, you can come here now, but you have to assimilate. And how fair is that under the guise of climate change when largely these countries have contributed very, very little to the reason why their countries are disappearing? So it's a bit too hard to get into in this seminar, but we kind of have to think about what would happen to nation groups who have to move because of deterritorialization. And we know from history what's going to happen. So
yeah, that's a really good point. The other question that I had, and you kind of mentioned it, is would I still feel connected to my nationality if my state ceased to exist? And would my cultural identity be protected if my state ceased to exist? My personal opinion is that if it comes from, from a country, well, if it comes to people who had a recognized country and ethnicity and nationality and territory, then yes. But how do we analyze this in comparison to ethnic groups who have never had a state, like the Kurds or the Roma people? And where do we draw the line in protecting and recognizing cultural identities? Like, I don't expect a solid answer. It's just, a question that came into my head. I understand it's odd.
Yeah, it is a tricky one. And the reason it's tricky is in terms of what I talk about deterritorialization, it's never happened. So we have no body of law for it. We only have law that talks really about citizenship. So I guess it really depends when you think about the idea of the right to practice culture. Kurdish people, I guess, but it depends because it's tricky because I want to say Kurdish people have a way of practicing their culture, but we know that that can be a huge problem, especially in Turkey. But I guess you kind of have to think, if there's a human right to nationality, how can there not be, by extension of that nationality, by your cultural identity, protecting your cultural identity? And this is where I say it's very important that it's connected to place, because without place, it's not protected. So if you don't reside somewhere that's willing to protect this identity, then ultimately you don't have a legal right, because it's not protected under international law. And it's very difficult to talk about groups that already exist within formed states. It's almost easier to talk about creating new law for people who have to relocate because of climate change, because creating new law is a lot easier than trying to go back and revisit old law and reform it. So yeah, there's no real answer to it, because state sovereignty can't be violated. No one can come in and tell a state that they absolutely need to protect a cultural or a national identity of a nation group. No one can do that. So I guess while we can make conventions and declarations, you can't violate state sovereignty. So there's no way of actually really putting in protections.
My last question and comment is on the last concluding question that you have. Do nation groups deserve to lose their state nationality and the right to practice their culture because of climate change? The current effects of climate change are mostly linked to the mass production in the West. That is a given. But there are also countries that have not had, for various reasons, the chance to develop as much, and are now producing a lot of waste and are harming the environment significantly. Can we, like, leaving renewable energy aside, because that is never a convincing argument for nations, for governments, not for nations. How do you believe how can we look at this issue of less developed countries using harmful production methods in this scenario? Like, can we tell to I don't know, China, stop producing so much, there is so much waste, when China says, you know, I'm developing, you developed already, let me do my thing?
Yeah, this is kind of a problem that goes at the heart of sustainable development. We've been debating this for so long, the historic emissions versus the need to actually do something now. And I guess one of the ironies about deterritorialization, in terms of your question, is that India is facing a huge amount of climate displacement because of sea level rise and deterritorialization. I think China also has some issues with climate displacement. So again, you can't step in and say, no, you can't do this, you can't do that. Again, you can't violate state sovereignty. If they don't want to sign on to a convention, they don't have to do it. So you can't really, so when I'm talking about distinct nation groups. So, sorry. Yeah, I'm talking about distinct nation groups, and I focus on the kind of small islands in the Pacific, because even if you are facing climate displacement, if you're in a large country, you can always move back. You know, you can move, and there are problems that come in with that, obviously, but you still have a place to go. You still have territory. If you're lucky, you're still within a territory that respects your nation group or your cultural identity, whereas people in the Pacific Islands don't have that. They won't have the chance to move. Like Kiribati is buying land off of Fiji. So they will have a place to go to if it happens. You know, they're working currently on trying to raise Kiribati above sea level structurally. But if that doesn't happen, they have a backup plan where they've bought land in Fiji where they can create a new state. So what if, you know, smaller like countries, what if, like, you know, you can't, there's no way of saying it, but the reason we focus on small island groups is that if they lose their territory, given the countries that they will have to go to, Australia or New Zealand, their chance of having their nation group protected are very low. And that's why I focus specifically on that. And also, you know, Australia and New Zealand are hugely responsible for historic pollution. So it kind of all comes together under climate justice and historic responsibility.
Do you believe that with the current steps that New Zealand is taking, it really won't provide help or protection to these ethnic groups or recognition? I was under the like, not for Australia, but for New Zealand, I was under the impression that it was taking significant steps in protecting its First Nation, in at least trying to recognize and correct in a way, as much as it can be corrected, the harm that the colonizers had caused.
Yeah, I mean, New Zealand does a substantially better job than Australia. That's not debatable, but also New Zealand has limited capacity to take people in. So groups will end up having to try go to Australia. So I say as well, because this is all political, it's not necessarily ingrained in society. So if you have a huge influx of people from other countries coming in, you can always get that political backlash. We've seen it, you know, and New Zealand are working really well on trying to create pathways for movement for people who do have to move due to climate change, particularly from the Pacific Islands. But the likelihood is that their nation groups still might not be respected in the same way as the Maori groups are in New Zealand, because the idea that these groups are already here, their culture is part of our country. So again, New Zealand is willing to protect these people, but would they be willing to protect in the same way? Sorry, I'm gonna have to let my dog in, otherwise he's not gonna stop. Sorry, I'm afraid of him breaking the door. Yeah, so are there any further questions?
I don't have any other questions. I don't know if anyone else would like to add something. Yes, so let's wait for a minute. Okay, so not really a question, but it certainly seems like this goes back to how we closed the last lecture. International law and human rights being a sort of rubber stamp for unjust global systems of power like capitalism.
Yeah.
Okay. You have an answer to that? A comment you would like to add?
Well, I mean, it's human rights law. We hail it as one of our greatest inventions, but it is so flawed. You know, you can't even claim a human rights violation if you can't go to your own state. You know, you can't say, oh, this country came and violated my human rights. So even making claims against your own country can be problematic if the country doesn't want to respect it, which is why we've had so many problems with trying to enforce human rights. And we now have the right to protect, but how far can you go in and violate state sovereignty? Only if they violate what's kind of considered war crimes to an extent, I guess, for lack of a better word. So if a country is saying denying a nationality to people born on their territory, won't come under, you can take it to the Human Rights Court, but it's not going to go anywhere anytime soon, fortunately.
So one question in the chat is, do you have anything to say from a feminist, I think, perspective on your topic?
You know, I've never actually looked at it from a feminist perspective. I think largely because a lot of the literature that comes out of kind of the Pacific Islands, if you're looking at a feminist perspective, is it a feminine or a feminist perspective?
It's a feminine perspective, but I'm
Okay.
not sure if it's a typo or not. That's why I said I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I guess the one thing, and it is problematic, is that in a lot of places, a lot of nation groups, you derive your nationality from your mother or your father. It's parental or maternal. And in the cases where it's fraternal, you're usually better protected than if it's maternal. And considering that women are going to be the ones, or who are majority the ones who bear the brunt of climate change, we know from general displacement patterns and migration patterns, men tend to move first and families tend to move after once the men have been settled. Highly problematic if women are being left in countries that have been really, there's no fresh water, it's very difficult to grow food. You're in a highly urbanized place with very little sanitation. So I guess on this perspective, there maybe has to be a special consideration of women and women's nationality rights, because women play distinct cultural roles in lots of nation groups in Pacific Island countries that's very different from what we think of in the Western. And it's not anti or pro-feminist, it's just a different cultural perspective on the role of the matriarch. So I wouldn't know how a Western state would be able to really deal with that. Be an interesting question.
And Jan-Jack's last comment was, well, there are things like the European Court for Human Rights, but you know, it is what it is in the end.
Yeah, I mean, the European Court is definitely a better way of getting arbitration. I mean, you know, when we look at the ICJ, again, it's usually swamped with war crimes or violations of international sovereignty. You can take cases. So there's one case that was happening in New Zealand that I've studied extensively, and he did take his case that he was saying that he was being denied his human rights because he wasn't getting refugee status in New Zealand. And he won that one. That was internationally arbitrated and he won. But that didn't mean that he didn't get refugee status. So this was a landmark agreement. This was amazing, saying that, yeah, you do have, you know, like climate change can be used as a reason to apply for asylum. But did it matter? No. We have an amazing, super long agreement that I read, and I'm sure it will be really important, but practice is often more important than doctrine. So what's written versus what's done, what's practiced, usually is what supersedes what's written. Unfortunately, that's law.
Great. Are there any other comments? Oh, great closing statement. It was.
Sorry, I can't get him to stop.
No, well, we all love a good conversation like that.
Yeah.
So it was indeed a great lecture. Thank you so much. If there are no other comments, we can stop the recording now. Thank you so much, Lisa.
Thank you.